Some years ago, a friend of mine by the name of Glenn de Cruz, who knew I was into storytelling, provided me with a story which he'd made up. He called that story The African Boat, and I'd like to relay it to you now. If you go back in history several hundred years, the little nation of Portugal was massive. It had a huge empire. A good eastern half of South America. And of course it had places like the East Indies, and several other colonies all around the world. Portuguese Timor, for example. Macau in southern China. And on the west coast of India, that little nation we still know as Goa, which, as we know, belongs to the Indians now, the people of India. The story begins in around about the late 1940s, when Goa was trying to get independence from Portugal. And there was a man named Xavier Baptiste, not his real name. Xavier Baptiste was the head of the rebels, and he had been caught and placed in the ancient fortress of Fort Aguada, which was then a prison. With Xavier, rather than put him in a dungeon, they'd put him in a little tower high up, a little cell with just one window, and he could jump up and hang on the bars and look out across the harbour. One day he was looking out across the harbour when he saw far away a smudge. The smudge became smoke. The smoke became a shape. The shape became a ship. And below him he could hear at last, "Whoa." The boat from Portuguese East Africa had come in. Now Xavier knew that when this ship came in at certain times of the year, there'd be a changing of the guard. His guards, the prison guards. The old ones, who were usually Nubians and certainly not native to Goa, were selected because they didn't want them to form personal relationships with the prisoners. And most of the guards became very hardened and very calloused quite quickly. So Xavier knew that he would get some new prison guards, and sure enough he did. The guard he got was a man named Nicholas Azuma. Now it's funny how some people have immediate antipathies towards others when they see them, but sometimes it goes the opposite way. There is a sort of commingling of souls when their eyes meet. And Xavier and Nicholas knew that they would get on right from the beginning. And although Nicholas was the guard, he struck up a friendship with Xavier, and they would talk occasionally through the bars of the corridor where the door was. And as time went on, the friendship became more. But as the year dragged towards the end, Xavier could see that his friend Nicholas, his guard friend, was getting a little bit upset, a little bit worried. And he said, "What's the problem?" And Nicholas said, "I'm going to have to go back home." And Xavier said, "Well, most people are happy at that, glad that their year's over. What's wrong?" And then he realised Nicholas had formed a relationship with one of the native ladies of Goa. Indeed, he wanted to marry her, but he had no way of letting the commandant, the governor of the jail, know it, because he would have had to put something in writing. and he couldn't read or write. So Xavier said, "Don't worry about that. Get me a pen and paper and I will write it and you can sign it and we'll see what happens." And this is what happened. Xavier wrote the letter. Nicholas presented it to the Commandant, and the Commandant thought, "Wow, this is the first time ever. A guard wants to actually renew and stay for another year at least." And so he granted him that. Then the friendship between the two became very strong indeed. And Nicholas would occasionally bring food and little tidbits which he shouldn't have brought to Xavier in his cell. And then one night, when Xavier was peering out and the moon was coming up, he heard a noise along the passageway. Then he heard the jingle of keys, and a key was in his lock, and the door opened, and there stood Nicholas. Now, Nicholas was a big man, big, strong, and fit. And Xavier thought, "I can't escape." Nicholas said, "Come with me." So they walked along various corridors very quietly, keeping in the shadows as they crossed the courtyard, and then along another corridor which led to the outside onto the beach. When they reached the beach, the moon was shining brightly from the sky. They kept in the shadows and walked along towards a hut some distance along the beach. And Nicholas and Xavier went inside. And then he realised Nicholas did have not just a girlfriend, he had a wife, and his wife was pregnant, very pregnant. So eventually, after having something to eat and some food and drink, Xavier was returned to the prison cell. Now Xavier started to think, maybe, just maybe, next time if that happens again, I'll be able to escape. I'll be able to get free of him. And then he thought to himself, but Nicholas is very fit. I'll have to work on it. So he asked Nicholas to bring him some things so he could get fit. Nicholas had no idea what Xavier was planning, of course. So he brought him a skipping rope and some dumbbells and things he managed to bring in. And Xavier spent the next 2 or 3 months getting very fit, running on the spot and so forth. And sure enough, this is what happened. One night, he heard once again somebody coming along the corridor very quietly. A slight jingle of keys, the lock of his door being opened, and there stood Nicholas. He said, "I want you to come to my place. I want to show you something." And this is when Xavier thought, yes, okay. So he went along to the hut again, and sure enough, now they had a child. And by this time, Nicholas really trusted Xavier. He said, "Take in some air if you like. Have a walk along the beach." And this is exactly what Xavier wanted. So he walked along the beach, and he got further and further, 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards. And at that time, Nicholas came out of his hut, holding the little baby, cradling the newborn baby in his arms. Xavier turned to run. He started to run, but his legs wouldn't let him. It was as if he was fixed to the spot. He strained and then he gave in. He knew he couldn't run. He knew that if he escaped, it would be the death of Nicholas. For letting him come out, letting him escape, he would surely be shot. So Xavier turned and very slowly walked back to Nicholas and the little child outside the hut. He realised that greater love hath no man than he would substitute his freedom, his total freedom, for a friend. But that's what he did. last, on a foghorn, the African boat was pulling away. Nicholas was on that boat with his baby and his wife Maria, and they were bound across to Mozambique to start a new life, and for Maria, a new life in a new land. Xavier stood looking out through those bars, and he knew that he'd done the right thing. He'd sacrificed his happiness for the happiness of others. But that's not quite the end of the story, because only a year later, the Indian government took over Goa, released all the political prisoners, and Xavier was once again free. Free to join his friends in Mozambique if he wanted to, but free, and that was a wonderful feeling.